I will be delivering my talk today in 2 languages and 2 modalities. You will be hearing me speak English while you watch me sign American Sign Language. I ask that if you are able, you try to receive the message bimodally as well, through your ears and through your eyes.
It is human nature to want to see things in black and white, to set up clear boundaries between self and other, between normal and not normal. But these boundaries can be very destructive, particularly when language itself is caught up in the middle. Human language has 2 modalities. It has an auditory oral modality for spoken languages, and it has a visual manual modality for sign languages. Most of the world is hearing. Deaf people only make up about 2% of the population, so most of the world's languages use the auditory oral channel. And most hearing people don't know very much about deaf people or about sign languages. For example, most people don't know that there are nearly 300 sign languages in the world, which all develop naturally in communities of deaf people, just like spoken languages develop naturally in communities of hearing people. Or even that American Sign Language and British Sign Language are extremely different, because sign languages are not representations of spoken counterparts, but they're languages in their own right. But there's a far more important fact that most hearing people don't know about deaf people and sign language, and that is this. Hundreds of deaf children born in the US every year are at risk of never acquiring a native language. And that's because 90% of deaf children are born into hearing families. And what that means is that they're born into homes where they don't have access, either to the signs that no one is using, or to the speech that they can't hear. You might assume that most parents, when they find out that their baby is deaf, will go learn sign language, but that doesn't happen usually. You might think you yourself, of course, would learn sign if you found out that you had a deaf baby. But what happens instead is this. Parents tend to feel sad and separated from their deaf child because they can't access them through their spoken language. And they might worry too that that child is going to be disabled in a world of hearing people. For the parents themselves, the hearing parents who aren't familiar with deaf culture, aren't familiar with sign language or with language acquisition itself, it's understandable that they would want to focus on the physical problem and want to help the child fix that problem so they could become more accepted in the hearing world. What is incomprehensible, however, is what happens when the parents turn to professionals in the field for advice on what to do. Parents turn to doctors, to audiologists, to speech-language pathologists for guidance on how to raise their deaf child. And far too often, not always, but far too often, parents are advised not to sign with their deaf children. They're told they should use the newest hearing technology to try to help their children listen and use their speech as much as possible, to help them, encourage them to use their ears and their mouths for communicating, not their hands and their eyes. Parents are assured it's going to be okay, that they will develop just like hearing people, probably because of the new technology, namely cochlear implant technology. Parents are told in most cases, cochlear implants will give your children access to language and sound so they can develop language naturally, just as a hearing child would. And cochlear implants are, by all counts, an engineering marvel. Many children do quite well with implants and learn to develop listening and spoken language like their hearing peers. The problem is, they don't always work. We don't understand all the reasons why they don't work, but it's widely known that there's huge variability in success with cochlear implants. And the main trouble is that this barrier then still exists, but parents can't see it. Because the only way to know for sure that a child hasn't acquired language is to see at the age of 3 or maybe even 4 that they're not using the language according to benchmarks for their age. And the reason for that is that it's not until 3 or 4 that you start to see the language in children. Okay? Those of you who know 3 or 4-year-olds or have conversations with 3 or 4-year-olds know how much language develops before 3 or 4. Okay? A typical 3-year-old has a vocabulary of around 1,000 words, and they're learning 4 new words every day. They've also developed many of the morphological and structural features of language. And so they can do things like add possessive S's and plurals. They can do past tense and progressive. And they can add that third-person singular S that changes I walk to she walks. By 4, typically developing children have about a vocabulary of 1,500 words, and they have acquired almost all the features of adult grammar. Decades of psycholinguistic research have shown that there is a critical period for language development, a time at which the brain is particularly plastic and ready to learn new vocabulary and acquire the syntactic structures of language. Early research to support this critical period comes from aphasia patients, okay, where children who had aphasia could recover much more completely their linguistic abilities than adults who had the same condition. And the argument that's made is that the deaf children's brains were still flexible enough that they could relearn the language that they'd lost, but the adults' brains were not flexible anymore. Further research comes from second language acquisition research. This graph here correlates the facility with language, English language, correlated with the age at which the person was first exposed to English. So you can see that if a person was exposed to English before 7, then they can acquire almost native-like ability in the language. But after that point, their ability to acquire language goes down considerably and bottoms out at around age 17. Okay? This graph would seem to suggest that as long as you have access to language before 7 years old, you could acquire native-like ability. But there's 2 things to keep in mind when looking at this. The first one is that this is second language acquisition data. All of the people in this study already had a first language that developed naturally. We don't have a graph like this for children who don't acquire a first language in the critical period to see what it looks like later on, but it's likely that would look different. Okay? The other thing to keep in mind is that our understanding of the critical period is that it's less than 1 slot where you can learn language, and it's more like a set of small critical periods within that time frame where the brain is ready to learn particular parts of language. For example, take phonology. The phonological window closes by around the end of the first year. We know from looking at infants that a 6-month-old from all over the world, regardless of what language they're exposed to, a 6-month-old can hear all the sounds of the world. However, by 10 months, they're already losing the ability to hear the sounds that don't occur in their own language. So for example, all children can hear the difference between right and light at 6 months. At 10 months, children from Japan can't hear that anymore because R and L are not in Japanese language. If there's a critical period for phonology, it's reasonable to assume that there's critical periods for other aspects of language as well, like morphology or syntax. We need more research in this area. But the evidence we do have comes from children who've been cut off from early access to language. You may have heard of Victor of Aveyron, who was purportedly raised by wolves in France, or Jeannie, the 13-year-old child found in California who had been cut off from language since the age of 20 months. We also know about orphanages around the world where children have no parents and they're sent to homes where they don't have a chance to socialize because there's neglect and abuse in the orphanages and they don't have exposure to language either. Clearly, in all of these cases, you can't separate the abuse, the effects of the abuse, from the effects of the language deprivation. However, when linguists have looked at the language of all of these children, they share some features in common. All of the children from these situations acquire vocabulary much more slowly than a typical toddler would, and with more work. They also, even though they acquire general word order, they never seem to develop the complex morphology or syntax that's the hallmark of human language. Some examples from Jeannie's speech give you a sense of what the language looks like if a child has experienced linguistic deprivation. You'll notice that her sentences are missing the morphological endings and the function words that hold the sentences together. So we know that there's clearly negative linguistic effects of not being exposed to language early in your life. But there's also cognitive effects. Lack of early access to language can affect your literacy ability, your verbal memory, your mathematical reasoning skills, and your executive functioning. Okay? That's to say nothing of the social emotional effects of not being able to communicate with your parents early in your life. But what about all the positive effects of being exposed to 2 languages early, of having a bilingual brain? We know that bilingual people do better at creative thinking and problem solving. Deaf bilinguals tend to do better in school, have more developed syntax in both languages, and also tend to do better with their cochlear implants than children who don't sign. So why? If we know that there's so many negative effects of not signing with deaf children, linguistically, socio-emotionally, and cognitively, and we know that there's so many positive effects of signing with deaf children on all these fronts, why do we continue to deprive deaf children of access to sign? I'd like to argue that it's this permeated notion of the able and the disabled, the normal and the not normal, that's in our society influences our decisions when we don't even know that it's happening. However, let me just entertain the 2 most common arguments against signing with deaf children. The first is that it would be too difficult for parents to learn a whole new language if they're really going to be focusing on speech anyway. The second is that you can't use sign to teach a child to read. And if you can't connect sign and reading, then it's not useful. Because if a child can't read and write, they're going to be disconnected from the world. In response to that first argument, I'd like to say that parents will learn to sign when professionals tell them that it's essential. In response to the second argument about reading, it's true. Our schools for the deaf in the US are not doing a very good job of teaching reading and writing to deaf children. Many of them are leaving high school and not reading at grade level. But those who blame sign language do so based on the erroneous assumption that you can't learn to read if you can't hear the sounds of English. I call that assumption erroneous because I spent 4 years studying literacy development in a school for the deaf in Sweden, where they do not set up a binary opposition between speech and sign, where all the children are expected to become fluent in both languages, and actually a 3rd language, written English, and where most of the children do become fluent. The difference between Sweden and the US is that in Sweden, educators and policymakers have recognized that early exposure to language, not exposure to spoken language, is what's critically important. The government will pay to relocate a family with a deaf child to a deaf cultural center so that the family and the child will be exposed to sign early in life, so that when that deaf child enters school at 6 years old, they're on par with their hearing peers in terms of language development. They have syntactical complexity in sign language, and they have not experienced any of the cognitive or social emotional effects of not having early access to language. So their teachers have quite a rich foundation to build on for the teaching of reading and writing. Let's take the idea of the word cup, okay? A child sees the word cup in print. If they have that concept of cup, they connect it to the concept, and they already have a sign for that cup. Once the child can connect cup with that concept, they can read that word. They have that connection. That's a simple example. Let's take a more complicated example from a classroom I observed in Sweden in 3rd grade. The expression hålla om in Swedish means to hold. Okay? Again, this is quite a simple concept. But when you add prepositions to hålla om, you get hålla med and hålla sig, which also appear very regularly in Swedish text. These can be confusing for deaf children because they look similar. Confusing for me too, learning Swedish, because they look very similar but they mean very different things. Hålla med means to agree, while hålla sig means to maintain. There were children in this 3rd grade classroom who didn't have any access to Swedish sounds. But every child in that room had these concepts of agree and maintain. And with those concepts, all the teacher had to do was build a bridge between the words on the page and the concepts the children already had. So the reason that we don't teach literacy this way, the reason that we don't build on first language acquisition, again, is this consistent distinction between other and self, between abnormal and normal, between disabled and able, that I believe we need to get rid of. We need to drop that distinction and accept the differences so that we can help develop both languages from early in life. And I want to leave you with one question, and that is, what if the cochlear implant were this miracle cure that many people think that it is? What if you could take every deaf baby and turn them into a hearing baby and get rid of deafness and sign language altogether? Would we do that? And if we did, what would we stand to lose? That maybe we would all benefit from stopping about thinking of the world in black and white and for accepting a more complicated gray. Thank you.